of the murder of one of the most pivotal figures in all of human history, in many ways the Jesus of the 20th century, Ernesto Che Guevara, someone who you have behind you, as do I, somewhere around up there. Someone who dedicated their whole life to the cause and who was not just this brazen militant who was ready to go to the jungle and be the first one in any guerrilla struggle to, the first one in line to fight, but he was also an incredibly complete human being. As a theoretician, he was as brilliant as they come. And one of the things that he emphasized, to bring it back to the Cultural Revolution, was the necessity that socialism had of creating a new man. Socialism is not just about changing the institutions of society, political, ideological, economic, etc. Socialism is about creating a new a human being that's much more human than ever before, that embodies the best qualities of what it is, of what it means to be human at a level of fullness that we've never seen before. So, Eddie, what are some of your thoughts? I know Che Guevara is, I think you're number one in terms of revolutionaries, but someone who has, of course, been very influential for you. Um, what are your thoughts on the day of his murder?
Yeah, absolutely. He's somebody who I admire theoretically. Like he was well read, and he wrote a lot of really interesting things, including about the Sino-Soviet split and the Cuban perspective. But the thing I admire the most about him is his character and his will. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and this is what a lot of my speech will focus on at the ACP convention. Like, at the individual level, politics comes down to character a lot of the time, right? It comes down to having principles, being able to stand on those principles, and being able to defend those principles, even when you're being suppressed or losing your job or violently attacked or doxxed or having your family members threatened. And Che was someone who stood on his principles almost to a fault. There was a story that's written in Che's excellent biography by John Lee Anderson, which I recommend everybody read. It's an incredible piece of work. Him and Fidel had been captured by some reactionaries, and they were basically saying, "Tell us you're not communist and we'll let you go." And Fidel was like, "Okay, I'm not a communist. Let me go." And then Che was like, "No, I am a communist. I'm a Marxist. It's not my fault reality is Marxist." He wouldn't say no that he wasn't a communist just so he could leave jail, because he didn't want to lie. He wanted to stand on business. He wanted to stand on principle. And that's just the kind of person he was. He was also the kind of person who would, when he was running Cuba's industry, running that section of the government, he would also go out in the streets and work with the Cuban people. And there's a famous picture of him doing some construction work and like shoveling in a street somewhere in Cuba, because he thought the person who was running the country's industry should be involved with actually working and see how those industries work at the grassroots level. So he was someone who was so well read and had such a deep understanding of Marxism compared to the people around him, that he was the one who had to run Cuba's industry. He had to be the economics guy, and that was a job he did very well, despite the fact that it wasn't his favorite. He would rather be out doing other things. But that's just a testament to his discipline, right? Like, while he was leading the revolution in the Escambray, they were setting up schools. They were building schools during the guerrilla war and teaching people Marxism in the Escambray Mountains. And Che and Raul Castro were leading these Marxism classes to educate the Cuban peasants and elevate their level of consciousness. Like, everything that you would want to be as a Marxist, Che was the epitome of that. And it's funny because people in the West, like Cuban gusanos or whatever, old men will be like, you wear Che Guevara on your shirt, but you don't understand what he stood for. You kids don't actually understand. It's like, no, I understand exactly what he stood for. And the more I learn about him, the more I admire him and the more I want to be like him. Someone who was well read, who was kind to those around him, who had the respect of everybody, who wasn't, who was the first to lead his troops into battle, not just sit back and sit on his butt. Just the epitome of what a communist should be, and somebody who I genuinely think about every day, and question what would he do. And last thing, He was fucking hated by the communists in Cuba, in Havana, who were a bunch of academics and a bunch of losers and a bunch of people who just like talking about Marxism but not actually doing anything. And they thought Che was an adventurist. They thought he was stupid for going to reach these dirty Cuban peasants who were illiterate and backwards and dumb. And we just needed to wait for capitalism to come to Cuba so these peasants can be transformed into workers and then we can have socialism. And Che said, no, screw you. I'm going to go organize the peasants. I'm going to teach them Marxism, and we're going to overthrow this gangster dictatorship and build socialism. And that's exactly what they did. And of course, you know, the academic Marxists then after the revolution realized he was correct, but it's sound familiar. Exactly. It's the same. It's the same. And that's, you know, people think Che must have been universally beloved by the communists in Cuba. No, they were a bunch of do nothing dickweeds sitting in their ivory tower talking about Marx and doing nothing to advance the class struggle, which, yes, sounds very familiar.
Extremely familiar. As Lenin was fond of saying, they think they're the brains of the nation, but they're actually the shit. And you're absolutely right about Che. And you mentioned the fact that he did a tremendous job as the minister of the economy. But do you know how he got that job? Do you
Uh,
remember the funny way how he got the job?
I don't remember the story behind that. The
He,
biography is like 700 pages. I
yeah, it's
lost
massive.
some of the
It's
anecdotes.
thick. But he's in a room with a series of revolutionaries, and they're trying to decide who's going to lead what position of the new state. And someone asks in Spanish, obviously, ¿Quién es economista? And Che was kind of dazing off in the back, and he heard ¿Quién es comunista? So they ask who's an economist, and he's in the back kind of dazing off, and he hears who's a communist, because in Spanish, economista, comunista, it rhymes. And he lifts his hand, and they point at him and they say, "Okay, you're going to be the minister of economics. It's going to be your position." He's like, "What the fuck? I don't know anything about economics," but he just took it, and then he did an amazing job with it. Talk about someone who's, whatever you put him to do, he's going to do an amazing job at it. But that's how he came to obtain that position.
Absolutely. I wish we could clone him. This is kind of interesting. Hugh G. Lee says, Eddie, if you want to build socialism in a feudal country, you need to delete feudalism and traditionalism and the hierarchy of feudalism. So going back to our conversation earlier, this is why Che loved the Cultural Revolution. Like,
Yep.
he was almost a bit of an ultra in like a good way, because he just like lived his life like a man from the future, like the epitome of what a communist should be. And that's why he needed Fidel, who was more of the pragmatist and more of the, I'm going to do what's necessary, even if, that means maybe making some concessions or making some tactical retreats. But Che was super pro-China, super pro-Mao, sided with China in the Sino-Soviet split. He called his child My Little Mao. And he loved the Cultural Revolution for that reason. He believed that these backwards feudal practices needed to be undone through education and other things. And that's like when they were building schools and teaching people Marxism during the guerrilla struggle. Like that was his idea, is we need to elevate the consciousness of the people and break this old feudal system and feudal culture. So Che would agree with you for sure.
He was, he was the Socratic gadfly for the socialist state of Cuba. That's what he was. Remember Socrates at the end, he says, I have been sent by God. I'm your gadfly, the one that's always questioning everything and helping you on the basis of that questioning get better. That's what Che was. He would not leave one thing that could be uncritiqued, and you can call him an ultra for that. But if he's an ultra, he is, as the comrade said, Infra Wiki, shout out to Infra Wiki, ACP comrade out of New York. As the comrade said, if he's an ultra, he's of the one that is of the good kind, of the type that wins and is forgivable. So yeah, you're absolutely right. He played that role of a sort of Socratic gadfly that I think socialist states need. Socialism doesn't mean everyone has a uniformity of thought and critique stops. On the contrary, that's how socialist states degenerate. When you stop having the openness of critiquing and being able to examine critically the trajectory that your revolution is taking. And what's interesting, to hit on the theme of education that we mentioned briefly, that's central to this construction of a new human being. When I was in Mexico earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak with one of the people that runs the Che Guevara Center in Cuba alongside Aleida, the two Aleidas, his daughter and his wife. And one of the things she mentioned to me, knowing that I'm a philosopher and one of my areas of specialty is Hegel, is that Che, towards in some of his last years, specifically when he was in the jungles in Africa, he was reading Hegel, and not just any Hegel. He was reading the Science of Logic. So perhaps one of the most dense texts you could probably get a hold of in the history of all of humanity was being read by Che in the middle of difficult combat against colonialism. So just an overall incredible human being of the future that, as the Cuban saying goes, we should all strive to be. That's the saying that basically like the Pledge of Allegiance that Cuban kids say in school. It's pionero por el comunismo, seremos como Che. Pioneers for communism strive to be like Che. Right before my grandfather died, he was in a sort of semi-vegetative state, unable to speak for many months before he passed. But right before he passed, literally the night of, I told him it was his birthday, and I told him when the room emptied, I said, Pionero por el comunismo. And with his last breath, it might have been the last thing he ever said before he died, he said, Seremos como Che. Let's strive to be like Che. So that's a spirit that animates the Cuban people who've been able to fight back against more than 6 decades of hybrid warfare and a brutal, illegal, criminal blockade. And many different other tactics that are within the toolbox of imperialism, as Eddie's fond of calling it. That's the spirit that animates them, and that's the spirit that animates every communist, every freedom fighter from around the world.